sorry there's no audience here.
No, that's all right. It's a pretty dismal day. I don't blame them, to be honest. Kind of the day to hunker down, and the way they talked up the storm as well.
The sky is falling.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did your family get sandbags out?
No, but when I was on the train replacement bus, I went past a store on Burwood Road, like an antique-y type store, and yeah, there was this guy just putting on like piles of sandbags. But the thing is, well, first off, this is in the middle of a main street, and I mean, Australia's a nice place, but if I put out sandbags, I'm not actually that confident that no one's going to take the sandbags if there's not currently a lake developing there.
Yeah.
And secondly, maybe I just don't know enough about sandbags. This guy had them like they were plastic bags of sand, and my understanding is if they're like not the kind of, you know, you need stuff so the water sort of soaks into the sand.
Right.
My understanding was
work?
if you just put down plastic bags of sand, you might as well be just putting anything down there because the water just runs around.
Between and through.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. I didn't realise that they had to soak in. I guess they soak in and then it compacts.
Well, yeah, I thought there was some element of that. I could be wrong.
I'm not a sandbag expert.
Yeah.
I just don't have any faith in them to... How does a bunch of sand in a bag stop water leaking through a door?
Yeah, that's...
Doesn't make sense. I mean, clearly they work. It's a pretty old thing.
But how does it work better than any other thing? You
Yeah.
know, like,
Yeah.
just do you need the sand? Is it just the bags?
Do you know what else works? Anything. Just dig up some of the garden and chuck it at the door.
Yeah, not living at the bottom of a hill. Not opening the door to let water in.
I think I think everyone is pretty apathetic towards it. Like, there's throwing these warnings around. This is going to be 3 months of rain in 2 days. And I saw it and I'm like, should we reschedule this interview? Nah, it'll be fine.
It's like the 3 months, January, February, March. You know, like, what 3 months are we talking about as the reference
Let's get
point?
the facts right first. And here we are. It's a light drizzle.
Yeah.
I tell you what, this is the best place to watch a storm though, this office. You get all these open, and you just stand like this and scream at the gods. It's fun. You know that the other night there was a huge storm. And I was up here working.
Yeah, last Friday.
Yeah, so I kind of like turned off all the lights, opened all the blinds, and just worked on my computer and had lightning and stuff. And then I started to get a bit freaked out because I could see that I was in the middle of the storm. Like I could see lightning landing over there, and then over there, and then over there.
Whoa.
And I'm like, oh, I'm in this thing. And then I just started to feel like, am I just in a metal cage in the sky right now? Like a big conductor. And I'm just standing in the window. And I started like Googling things like, can you get struck by lightning indoors? Apparently you can. So then I freaked myself out. Then I found out the next day, that someone in Churnside Park got struck by lightning and died in that storm.
Yeah, horrible that.
Which is the neighbouring suburb. So I guess the lesson there is don't stand in this office and tempt the gods, because I'm like, oh, I'm pretty safe, I'm sure. Turns out.
Clothes are dry.
Yeah.
No, when you
shouldn't be so cocky about it.
when you mentioned that, I got this visual of like how they drop shark divers in the sea with the cage and the sharks come up.
Yeah.
But it's like you dropped into clouds and the sharks are made of lightning and you just but it's this office floating in a storm cloud.
That's how I felt. Yeah, pretty much. I should introduce you, seeing as we've just kind of cold cut straight into interviewing. Dr. James Collett.
That is me, yes.
That's so cool. It's really it gives me a great amount of pleasure to say that, because I've known you since we were just a couple of punk kids.
Yeah.
Liddell High. When would we have met?
Year 9, yeah.
Yeah? Yeah, we would have met, we were probably 14.
Yes, spot on, I reckon.
Yeah. Who knew any of us would amount to anything, and here you are, a doctor of psychology. And what's your position at RMIT?
So I'm an associate lecturer.
Okay.
So basically it's quite hierarchical, and so you've got associate lecturer at the bottom, then it goes lecturer, then it's senior lecturer, then it's associate professor, and then professor. And so if there's any bit of trivia that's interesting from that, it's that when people say they're a professor, usually people think, oh, that's a qualification. Technically, it's a job title. And so that means that if someone has been a professor, it's not always that, I mean, you can give up being a professor.
Okay. So you don't hold that title forever. You have to stay in the position to keep it.
Yeah, technically. If you've someone where you've kind of, people have said, oh, look, you're so cool that we're going to basically say you should be a professor forever. You get these kind of honorary things like emeritus professor. Yeah, technically it's a job rank, not like you don't do like a professorship of something.
I never knew.
Yeah,
although the world of academia is very estranged for me. I don't understand it. I don't understand what a degree is. Yeah, I just learned from reading books.
It's a strange world. Academia's where it's like learning from reading books, but it's much less fun because it's people telling you have to learn from books.
That's the bit that I couldn't get my head around. I'm very undisciplined. As soon as someone says you should learn this, I'm like, what are you, my dad? I'll learn whatever I want. Kick that book over and just pick up a different one. Secretly, I'm like, I was enjoying that book.
Well, it's interesting you say that because studying psychology, there's been a ton of interesting stuff come up, and I do really enjoy my job lecturing on it. But that said, when I was studying, I would often think, this book would be really, really interesting if I didn't have to read it for uni. But because I do, I'm only going to spend, the 2 weeks before exams or whatever.
Yeah. You got to feel bad for the teachers in high school that prescribe you books like we were talking about before, The Outsider and Romeo and Juliet. And they're always saying they're really good books, you should enjoy them, but there's just no way we're going to when we have to read them.
Exactly, yes.
I sympathise with them now that how many teachers told me that? You think you'll like this one? I'm just like, no. I'm not going to, just out of spite.
Yeah.
I already dislike it.
They almost need to do the old bait and switch where they say, all right, guys,
Reverse
this
psychology.
is the book that we'll be doing it on. But just for like silent reading, I've brought in this other book. Here you go. And then end up doing like all the coursework and stuff around the other book.
Yeah. Get that Harry Potter out of my face. I'm reading Macbeth. Yeah. I'm going to put the air conditioner on 1 second.
Oh, yeah, no worries, mate.
I'm glad that you came out of high school not into writing fiction, because when we were in high school together, especially in the later years, this is what people would say to me. They'd be like, did you read James Collett's paper on whatever? It's amazing. I mean, you're a good writer too, Andy, but did you read James as well? I was like, I'm good. And you were like, you were revered already as a writer. So I'm glad to have you here today to pick your brains about, I don't know, you're what's the word? Prolific writer in the academic world, and I want to know how that can translate to these kids who are trying to learn fiction. And yeah.
Oh, sure thing. Before we get started, though, I should definitely say your creativity in high school far surpassed mine, and just something I was thinking about. It was like, I think this was actually before I knew you, but it was like we had a class where we were kind of lined up near each other, and it was like an artistic project you'd done. You did this thing where you basically cut up like a Star Trek comic that had come in a show bag and then remixed it into its own story. And just, I think about that like semi-regularly. Like, there should be an art form, like there should be a word for that, and it should be something that people do.
Comic remix.
Yeah.
Are you sure that was me? Because I have no memory of that.
No, that was definitely you.
It does sound like something I'd do, but cool.
Yeah, no, it has stuck in my head all these years.
All right. I'd love to track that down, although I'm sure it's been recycled into toilet paper by now. Well, thank you. Thank you for that. So you don't write fiction, but you write a lot. What's your day-to-day like in terms of your writing habits? Do you write every day?
So let me think. So just as some context, I should point out, so most of the writing I do is around reporting the results of psychological studies. And you mentioned before being a doctor, which is cool. I think you're the first person to really call me it, so
Oh, really?
it feels pretty special. Yeah. So
I couldn't wait to call you it.
Oh no, thanks,
That's
mate.
so
I really appreciate it. I'm super excited. And the reason no one calls me it is, of course, I'm not a medical doctor. It's because my title is doctor because I've done something called a PhD, which stands for Doctor of Philosophy, but it's applied to anything academic. So the idea is that at that level you're like a philosopher in your chosen field. And so,
Right. Never knew that.
yeah, it comes from like, kind of when unis were developing in medieval Europe, kind of thing.
Right. Is that before, they called it science, they called it philosophy? Is that where it comes from, or is that post that?
Well, I guess before they had all of the tools that modern science has to look at things,
Yeah.
a lot of it was simply the logical processes of thinking, and that's what philosophers deal in. So yeah, you're spot on in that regard.
And just to go back to what you said before, about being a professor, is that your goal? You're going to be a professor?
That's an interesting thing. I don't know if it's good writing advice, but it's hopefully good kind of lifestyle happiness advice. I would never want to be a professor. So one of the things I got into university, lecturing and academia and that sort of thing. I don't actually enjoy the scientific research or the clinical practice half as much as I enjoy teaching. I love teaching, and people, my students seem to think, they're interested in my classes. They tend to find them entertaining and, informative. And so, yeah, to me, that's my way of giving something back to society or finding my niche.
Yeah,
and the thing is, when you move up the food chain, you lose touch with that. And so it would actually be a nightmare for me. With it being a professor, you tend to be heavily into the administrative side of things. So in some ways, it's a trap where you got into this profession because you enjoy it, and then suddenly you're doing more business management rather than the stuff that got you into it.
Yeah, right.
The other thing I'm always cautious about is the research side of things. One of the things that I struggle with is actually it's highly competitive in terms of getting funding. And so your position is highly contingent on your ability to get funding from, bodies like CSIRO, NHMRC, so psychology comes under health research, so it's that sort of health and medical stuff. And yeah, for me, my ambition is actually to get to senior lecturer, where it's kind of, midway up in terms of career progression, and just enjoy life.
Just sit there.
Yeah.
Right.
So if anyone listens to this who, is of that opinion of money equals happiness, or you need to be like, have a business card that says I'm the best person in the world, you quickly grow out of that, or most people do, and I think the sooner the better, it's just, so do a job based on lifestyle and just be happy and find what will help you do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Don't just climb the ladder for the sake of it.
Yeah.
And as a senior lecturer, is there as much a research side of it? Do you still get to indulge in doing research in your field, or is it more just lecturing?
Yeah, so at the moment, so thinking about my research experience, so the PhD, which when I'm talking about writing, that's probably what I'll be reflecting on the most, because, I spent, I started 2000 I had a bit of a weird pathway, but basically I started this document in 2009 and I was doing it part-time. It was 100,000 words at its biggest, but the final document ended up at 70,000 once I'd refined it, polished it, made it, as good as it could be. That was on bipolar disorder, so I did a series of studies looking at reward sensitivity and how people with bipolar disorder might get wrapped up in reward seeking. And then from there, my current research, the stuff I'm most passionate about is about compulsive hoarding. So acquiring too many possessions, having difficulty discarding them, and yeah, how that causes distress for people.
What's the, in that hoarding thing, I'm really interested in this hoarding. And I find it fascinating that that's where you've sort of landed your interest in your field. How do you distinguish between a hoarder and a collector?
Oh, well, that's what got me into it, I suppose. So, because as you know, I love collecting things. Like I've got I think last count, the video game collection was around 800. So I love collecting things, and I love, even if I don't collect something personally, I love meeting or seeing someone, and they're showing off a collection of some sort. Like I'm just, even if it's not my thing, I'm like, total respect to you kind of thing.
Yeah, right.
And so I was really interested in that idea with, well, where do you draw the line, and are they similar things where if you're a collector, but maybe, you've got that trait of appreciating possessions, but then maybe if it swings too much towards being a way that you cope with bad experiences in life, is that when it becomes hoarding? Or is it, are they just two different things?
Two different things.
And interestingly enough, a student I worked with, her and myself, we just finished a study where it was really the first study to actually look at this in a quantitative way, so collecting a ton of data off different people and looking at it statistically. And it seems like they are different things. It seems like hoarding and collecting, they don't really co-occur as much as you would think.
Yeah, right. And where is the key in the difference between them? Sort of psychologically, what's happening that makes them different?
That's still actually admittedly a work in progress. From what we've looked at in the data so far, it simply appears that hoarding is associated with more, I guess, my take on it, and it's hard to pull this from the data one for one, but my take on it and the prevailing theory is that hoarding is about, I like to use the term filling a void. So when you've got, and by void I mean, feelings like isolation, sadness, I'm not going to necessarily call it clinical depression, but just having a life dissatisfaction. And so possessions become a way to sort of shore up your defenses against that. They give you something tangible to latch onto as a source of contentment, and a way to maybe supplement self-esteem, or maybe just a bit of excitement in life, getting a new thing.
When I think of it from a writing perspective, like if I was going to have a character that was a hoarder and one who was a collector, I'd probably give the hoarder kind of elements of anxiety. Because it seems to me like they're kind of, I might need that just in case. Like they're a bit anxious about what might happen, so they want to keep things, just in case. Whereas a collector has more of I don't feel like you'd get that. It's just a sense of pride in look at all these things I've collected and put in shiny glass cages, and so I feel like as a writer, you definitely treat them very differently as characters. That's quite an insightful take, because you're right that hoarders do typically give that reason for saving possessions. A stack of newspapers just in case they need the article, or
exactly, so the need for perfect recall of stuff, or it's not enough to I read this, but I need this here in case I ever need to refer back to it.
That's exactly how I feel about all these books. My collection of books that I'm apparently hoarding.
Definitely, yeah. So that's kind of that makes a great point. You've got a fantastic library of books sitting behind us,
and I'll never give them up in case I need to refer to that one sentence in that one book at some point in my future.
And I'm the same. If I read a book, I hang on to that book normally, or I have, I don't just read a book and then back to the op shop or lend it to a friend or whatever. It becomes part of my library of books, so to speak. And it's interesting because a lot of collectors, I think, would actually, they wouldn't necessarily say, this might come in handy for a rainy day kind of thing. But you definitely get the sort of things like, what if I need to go back to this, or what if I want to look at this again or experience this again? And also that, if I don't hang on to this, who else is going to? What if it ends up in the rubbish? There's almost a sense of responsibility for possessions, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, if we're talking about, we're not going to call Melbourne Museum an institution of hoarding kind of thing. And so it's really hard to draw a line. And I mean, I've seen, you look on the internet and people showing off collections of whatever. And some of this stuff is like museum quality collections, or they know more about this stuff than anyone in the world. And it's just like, wow. Yeah. And then some of it isn't that. And it's really complex.
I naively just kind of waded into some exactly like that. I started this show. It's called Bricks and Flicks. I review a film while building Lego, right?
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
It's on the same channel where this is going to be. And so I'm like, that's pretty cool. And I'm like, okay, where can I share this online? And I'm like, well, I shared it on some film reviewing Reddit pages about film reviewing. They seem to like it. And I'm like, well, I'll share it on the Lego page on Reddit. No, they did not like it. They're like, why did you choose that kit? They were like criticizing my everything. And then I had a little look through all the other submissions on that page, and they were like that. They were like museum quality Lego displays. Like, here's my house so far, and it's like a picture of their house which is just taken over by Lego. Like, this one took me 500 hours to build. This one. And I'll come in with that little plane up there. Like, what do you guys think?
I followed the manual.
Yeah, get out of here with that. Yeah, I just walked into that and I walked back out like, fair enough, guys. I'm not welcome here. I am an amateur Lego enthusiast at best. Sorry, that was a complete sidetrack story.
Oh no, it's interesting about how. Well, firstly, that people can have immense knowledge about things, and I mean that's good in a way, because one of the things, there's a big kind of term that gets used a lot in self-help literature nowadays, and it's mindfulness, or that we need to be mindful about things.
Yeah.
And definitely mindfulness, it's the evidence base that's emerging around it is showing it's really great for helping people with a variety of problems, which is good. One of the things about it, though, is it's really hard to define.
It's a vague term.
Yeah, you get, and even the kind of definition people always come back to in presentations, they're like, oh, mindfulness is vague. Let's define it, though, so we've got like something concrete to work with. And it's like, mindfulness is paying attention in a specific way, place and time, and you just kind of, your head's spinning like a psychedelic kind of 70s movie experience. The term I like to use that I find helpful when I think about it is actually appreciation. So appreciating the world around you, whether it's just noticing things you normally wouldn't, like looking around a room and experiencing things in it that you might normally just let kind of fly under the radar or go over your head. And the other thing, of course, is I think that people who have found something in life to have a deep appreciation of, I think that's really cool, and I think it really does speak to a healthy thought process, or not even that's maybe too psychological a way of putting it, but a healthy engagement with reality. They've found something they can really appreciate.
Yeah.
The other side, of course, is the bad side is when it puts up walls in terms of the entry level community, where instead of saying, that's awesome, did you know that set's like the 10 millionth plane Lego have released since they started in Denmark in the 50s kind of thing, and instead they're like, get out of here, noob kind of thing. Fly your plane elsewhere.
If I was there in person, I'd smash that plane. Yeah. I don't know. It's it is what it is. Next time I'm going to make a bigger set. I'm going to go back into that Lego subreddit and say, how's this? It's limited edition, whatever. I don't know.
Just watch that they don't get into it might be a big set, but it may not be as technical as a smaller set, and you don't want a Lego fan to say it's not the size of your bricks, it's how you use them.
You know what? I'm just going to ask them what I should do. Which set should I... If I'm going to review Star Wars, what Lego set should I make? Involve them in the process?
Sounds like a plan.
Might turn them around.
Lego outreach, I like it.
Yeah, it's such a strange but awesome idea. It came about because I wanted to just do a podcast where, it's one thing to have people sit and talk to each other, but, just to make it 1% more interesting to watch, we could be building Lego right now. So I had that idea. Just a podcast about anything, but you build Lego just to make it slightly more interesting. And then I also wanted to do some film reviewing, so then those two ideas just found each other in my brain after about a year of coexisting, and I went, I can stick them together.
I like the, summarizing the creative process. It's almost the old El Paso ad. This taco, why not both?
Yeah, except it took me a year to get to the why not both bit.
It's an important thing to think about in writing. Sometimes good ideas just need to, I like the term percolate, like coffee. They just need to spin around in your head. And that's something people always told me, because I had a knack for basically my reputation at, I studied at Swinburne University, and my reputation was a guy that basically just spends his degree walking around and talking to people, and you never see him doing any work.
Yeah.
But one of the things, and to a point, that was very, very true. But to take it in a more helpful direction, one of the things I always found a great benefit to you know, if you're sitting in front of the computer, or if you're in that space of trying to actively work on something and it's just not happening, I think a lot of stuff happens when you're just walking around thinking about it. It doesn't even have to be directed or guided thinking. You know, you're not sitting there kind of straining your brain like,
think, damn it.
Yeah. But
I think the walking aspect is important because that's how I would get past any writer's block is, okay, I'm stuck. Why am I stuck? And I just come up with a question. Well, I don't know what that character does here. All right, I'm going to go for a walk with that question and 5K walk or something, take a notepad, and by the time I get back, I'm going to have an answer to that question or a few answers to that question. Yeah. But I think the walking bit, I don't know, what does that do? It just keeps you moving, keeps your...
mental stimulation, you're seeing different things,
Maybe that's
gets
it,
the blood flowing.
Yeah. You know, that thing about, we were just saying, kind of touched on, a lot of writers say this, like they just have to wait for inspiration to strike, sort of thing. Like that when they get writer's block, they'll just stop and wait for the answer to occur to them. And I always sort of try to poo-poo that in a way, like that's not the way to do it, because I think if you just turn your mind to it, grab it and wrestle with it and define the problem, define the question why you're stuck, and then actually actively take it, like go for a walk or talk to people about it. Or what we do here is we use the whiteboard. We have what we call whiteboard sessions.
Yeah. And
just it's like, where are you stuck? Let's whiteboard it out. And a good hour of doing that can save you a good 3 months of waiting for inspiration to start, to strike you. So I try to dissuade people from that. You know, you're not a musician. If you're a musician, do that. Yeah, when inspiration strikes you, write a song. But if you're a writer, and you're not going to just sit there for 3 months waiting to figure out what one character does.
Yeah. I love the helpfulness in that, in terms of, it's all well and good to say, oh yeah, just wait and, inspiration will strike. But if you're waiting 5 years, is there anything else you could have done to speed this along?
Let's get the whiteboard out, yep. Jot it all down. What we do is an exercise where you don't man the whiteboard. The person with the problem sits and someone else goes on the whiteboard, and the person at the whiteboard asks questions, and then you have to explain it. And in the act of explaining it all and them writing it, you have to explain it in a way that they can write it. So you have to articulate it clearly to someone. And just in the process of doing that, it's like they've never bothered to do that, to sort of say it all out clearly.
Yeah.
And it just kind of gets their thoughts straight. And then by the time they get to the problem, they've got some solutions in mind already. Or they've kind of figured something out that was stuck in their head. I don't know. Yeah. Don't just keep it in your head and wait for the answer.
Yeah, it's amazing how that... Because often you need some perspective on something, but you can't if you're writing it. It's your ground zero. And so having that other person who can be a way of you taking a step back, or guiding that process of taking a step back, can be hugely helpful. I'm constantly... I should say something positive, surprised, but it's probably more just upset that, my own writing is nowhere near as good as I can make other people's writing, in terms of, so as a supervisor of research students, a lot of what I do is actually editing stuff that other people have written. I've done kind of my big written work to get into the career I'm in now. But a lot of my work, and the teaching as well, which marking an assignment is essentially proofreading someone's work and providing commentary. And I'm struck by it's just so much easier when you're not the person that's written it. I'll leave comments and stuff, and I'm not trying to judge the person writing it, but I'll just be thinking, when I go back to my work, I probably find the same mistakes or more kind of thing, because you just get stuck in that.
You're too close to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you need to get the outsider's perspective. While you're saying that, I was wondering, do you reckon you'll ever write anything for a public audience? A book, not necessarily a fiction book, but so what you write now, I presume, is academic writing. It goes into journals, and it's more in the world of universities. But
correct.
A book that, do you ever reckon you'll write something that'll go out in the bookshelves and gimmicks?
Yeah, I would absolutely love to. So yeah, let me think. So you're right. Academic writing is very formulaic and it's very technical, and it's not always a very satisfying writing experience because of that. It's about, you've got some scientific data, and you are reporting on that data. So you're thinking, well,
Yeah.
what's the take-home message that we can learn from this experiment? How can we advance knowledge? So
Well, it's precise. It needs to be precise language, and in that you strip away anything. Like, let's not worry about making it entertaining or palatable or anything like that. It's just precise language. But then if you're writing for a general audience, you got to kind of take it a bit the other way. Make it not necessarily entertaining, but, intriguing or interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not enough that it makes sense. It has to engage people as well.
Well said.
It's a great question to ask, because, I mean, it's something I would really love to do. At the moment, I think one of the ideas that's sort of turning in my head that probably won't eventuate until years from now is to write something about hoarding, because, I am hugely into it. The other thing would be to take the other side of the coin and maybe write something about collecting. There are certainly lots of people that collect things, and if I could write something that, maybe I don't know if it would help people to collect things or help them appreciate collections, or if it would just be an entertaining read. But yeah, I would absolutely love to do something for that sort of public consumption, rather than being, stuck in a scientific journal, behind a paywall, and it's just really a technical document.
Yeah. Is there any time when collecting, without crossing into hoarding, that collecting is a problem?
Oh, I would think undoubtedly. So I started reading up on that online in preparation for the study that we just finished collecting data on. And it's interesting. I found an article on a guy who was talking about a collection, and he was saying how, he could have bought a house if he hadn't basically funneled his money into this collection. So even in a collection, it doesn't mean there can't be excess and a lack of regulation of the collecting process. Other people have talked about the regret of, maybe they've actually sold off a collection. So it's almost a double-edged sword in a way. If you think of collections as engaging in the material world, which doesn't necessarily have to be as superficial as people say when they say things like, oh, don't be materialistic. In a way, collectors are engaging with the material world on a really deep level of appreciation.
Yeah, almost a romantic kind of level.
Yeah, or, you're inviting, as early as the late 1800s, a very famous psychologist, William James. He's regarded as kind of the founder of psychology. Sigmund Freud is kind of the stereotype of, psychology emerging. But this William James guy, if you read up on the history of psychology, absolutely pivotal figure. And he had this idea then of he called it the material self. And the way he summed it up was, and remembering this is, 100 years ago, over 100 years, he said, the line between what a person calls me and what a person calls mine is a very hard line to draw. So even back then, they were conscious of people there. You invite possessions into being part of your personality, you use them to communicate things about yourself, and you use them to, I guess, define things about yourself as well.
I'm thinking of Fight Club and that whole thing about you are not what you own and all those things.
Yes.
That shrugging off of that, and how much of a revelation that was to me as a teenage viewer of like, yeah, I'm not my things. Although here I sit in a room full of things that I'm proud to say are mine. Yeah. Well, that's really interesting. Yeah. What was his name? William James.
Yes, William James.
Yeah.
He was very... So one of the cool things, so I've mentioned that modern scientific writing can be very formulaic. Not always, and I can go into a bit on how you can, or where the artistry to it is later on. But one of the cool things about when psychology, and really any science when they were emerging, so for most sciences, around kind of between, the 1700s and 1800s was when we got a ton of new scientific progress developing. One of the cool things was you could advance a new idea with very, you could put ideas out there without necessarily as much support to back them up. Whereas nowadays, the ideas we put forward are heavily invested in previous ideas, and the scientific community is very quick to, I suppose, not shoot down new ideas, but just not give them a forum unless they have a lot of groundwork in place.
More incremental now rather than your revelation sort of thing.
Exactly,
Yeah.
Which isn't necessarily a bad thing, because, we do want a process of refinement to thought in the same way that, you wouldn't run a book to press after you've typed, the end or whatever kind of thing, or done your acknowledgements after you've finished it, you would read it again. There's an editorial process. There's a process of taking what you've done and being able to look at it critically and refine it. And it's I suppose that's what this process of screening ideas is about. But you do have to wonder as well that sometimes I think we maybe balance on the other side too much, and there's maybe some good ideas that get neglected, or that people feel they can't speak up or just suggest something
that almost seem too out there.
Yeah, exactly.
Too crazy. Yeah.
And if it turns out to be wrong, well, okay, that's all right. But sometimes we just need people to generate different things to keep human knowledge, the knowledge base, progressing.
Yeah. Bring your crazy ideas out. Well, that's always been the case though, because these people that had these huge new ideas were always ahead of their time. They didn't find traction until it wasn't immediately accepted. It was always a process of decades.
Exactly. Yeah.
You asked me before, and you said this was a very cliched question of what's my favorite book.
That's right. Yes.
And I wanted to ask you the equally cliched question of who's your favorite psychologist figure, psychoanalyst, or.
Oh.
So do you think Freud is like a quack, like I often hear? Is it's pop culture psychology is what they kind of say, with his like everyone wants to sleep with their mum or whatever kind of thing.
It's fairly radical stuff.
Yeah.
Thinking about it, so I'll address the Freud bit first because that's the easiest bit. So Sigmund Freud, the ideas he advanced aren't widely used in modern psychology. And because of that, and because of the radical ideas were given the most press coverage, if you will, people tend to look back on him and think, there's a bit of a weird guy.
Yeah.
That said, though, he's given psychology a ton of profound stuff. So even just the idea that you can have things going on that aren't conscious thoughts, but, they're floating in the back of your head, but they can have a real impact on you. That comes from Sigmund Freud. The idea that the relationship between the child and the caregiver is hugely important, which every psychologist would endorse as fact. That was popularized by Sigmund Freud. The idea that we defend against things that threaten us, whether it's by denial or whether it's by just avoidance, but things that threaten ourself or who we are psychologically. Sigmund Freud did a lot of the framework of that. So a lot of this stuff, he didn't necessarily think of the idea kind of thing or generate it from scratch. He was well read, and a lot of it, though, he put it into a framework and popularized it and got other people thinking about it. So he is an absolutely pivotal figure. The other interesting thing you find about Freud is that people suggest, and I can't test this myself, apparently if you read his work in the original German, there is a lot of connotations to words we just would not get if we maybe knew enough basic German to translate a book, but didn't know enough about the the spirit behind the words or the message or that sort of thing. So
it's nuanced in a way that's lost in translation.
Exactly. It's in the, when you're writing a novel, you'll pick words to capture a certain emotional tone or to lead the reader along a line of thought or to set a scene in that way. And imagine, if you used a thesaurus and basically changed you could only have one word for one thesaurus category and it had to be the same word every time. Imagine how much your writing would lose.
Yeah.
So it's kind of like that problem with translation.
Yeah, right. I never thought of that. I often wonder that, though, with any literary work that's translated, and especially like the Russians, they're so good in English. And it's like, well, how good is it in Russian?
Yeah,
like, how much is lost because they're some of the best English language novels and they're translated. How does that work?
Yeah,
that's always been something that's just puzzled me.
And it certainly it teaches you to appreciate a loving translation as well when you have read some books where you're like, this isn't that good, but I don't think it's the author's fault.
Right, yeah, you think it's the translator.
Yeah, if you, I'm tying in with my collection of video games and my love of fantasy novels, I'm also massively into anime, so I basically, what is really, really cool, and that's where I target my interests.
Yeah.
And one of the things, if you've ever watched anything that relies on subtitling, it's basically the process like you were saying.
You preach into the choir. I'm always... subs, not dubs.
Yeah. But if it's bad subs, comparing it to good subs, you quickly realize
True.
this person has got the spirit of this, work of art or whatever, and this person has not.
It's the worst when you get like the community subtitles and they take it upon themselves to put little jokes and stuff in the subtitles.
Yeah.
No. Get out of it. You're not part of the creative process.
Thanks for assaulting artistic purity.
I'm just going to check these cameras real quick because they're dodgy.
No problem. That gives me time to think of that book question you asked.
Do you have an answer for that question? It was actually, who was your favorite, like, psychologist, I guess?
Okay.
Yeah. Are you a Jungian, Freudian, or a Piagetian? You got to marry one.
My favourite psychologist is probably a guy called Geoffrey Gray.
Okay.
So Geoffrey Gray was a British researcher, and he's probably not well known outside of psychology. But he's just massively influential, and he did a lot of work around the way that people approach reward and punishment, and how reward and punishment affect your personality and your consciousness. Interestingly enough, talking about translating, you'd be familiar with the idea of Pavlov and his dogs, and he did some learning work with ringing a bell and getting a dog to salivate if the bell was paired with food.
Oh, okay, yeah.
It's
training the reward center kind of thing.
Yeah. So he did a lot of stuff with how that sort of, he called it conditioning, but it was basically a learning process. He was a Russian researcher, and Geoffrey Gray was actually the first guy to fully translate like one of Pavlov's books. In fact, I think it was his thesis or his post-thesis project, because he knew Russian and English.
Right.
He actually translated and published this, and then that led to him doing a collaboration with Pavlov was unfortunately dead by that time, but some of his successors in his lab group. And it's really, you read this book, it's from 1962, but it's just crazy to think that Western psychologists and Russian psychologists were collaborating, because don't forget this was the Cold War era. So it was just a massive thing that he accomplished doing that.
Yeah,
But yeah, I just find his writing quite profound, and some of it's very, very technical with the learning projects, but then some of it is quite, where I like it is where it's more at that personality level of, well, okay, what are we about as human beings? And towards the end of his career, he took this immense base of evidence that he'd got from looking at those, which coloured button is the pigeon going to press kind of studies, and then going to things where it's like reflecting on the nature of people, which, yeah. They
always end up just giving rats cocaine. Seeing what happens. What button will they press? I've found recently the Jung kind of Jungian thing about the what are they called? The archetypes.
Yeah.
Really interesting, because it relates so closely with storytelling and with character development. And I don't know, it's a really easy thing to sort of, as someone trying to create a narrative and write a story and create characters, it's almost like a character profile sheet that you can use and pick elements of these different archetypes. And I've just become fascinated with that. And I wonder if you have any other sort of, parts from what you've learned through psychology that would be in a similar way interesting in creating characters or creating stories.
I guess just to touch on Jung, so I do really like Carl Jung. I don't actually think of him as a psychologist, though. No, you're right. He's definitely seen as a psychologist. But if you read his stuff, I see him as more a spiritualist or something. Or a philosopher.
Maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. It's less about scientific evidence about how the mind works, and more just a really interesting and profound system for, some ideas about how things work. And, just that he based it on characters recurring in stories and in mythology. And
I guess I can see that now straight away as you say that, because it is all abstractions. Like everything's kind of metaphors and, an abstract way of thinking about it. Whereas if you're trying to take it scientifically, you're going to be trying to quantify it and nail it down as factual rather than talking about shadow selves and
Exactly.
old emperor kings or whatever.
Yeah, like rate yourself from 1 to 10 on how much of a shadow self you are. There are some things in psychology that are psychological but very hard to look at.
Yeah.
With Carl Jung, my feeling is just this stuff's an interesting system of beliefs about psychology as it is. Why bother wrecking it by trying to anchor it to a system of measurement that it probably just doesn't match?
Yeah. All right, so I've milked Jung for all he's worth. Where should I go next in my quest to understand people better?
Well, 2, not specific authors, but 2 lines of psychology. And so the first one is narrative psychology. So narrative psychology, as you might guess from the term narrative, it's really about how people form their life stories. And so for someone who's in the business of writing, life stories, even if they're a fictional life story, you're basically designing a person's psyche in a way when you write a novel and write a character. And so narrative psychology is about, I suppose one way of putting it would be saying it's not about individual events, it's about a flowing timeline. So it's not just, this experience happened, let's talk about it in isolation. It's about, your life is a chain of events, it's a sequence, and it has ups and downs, and also that the way we frame things determines whether or not they're ups and downs. And so for someone, a good example that people can maybe empathize with is relationship breakups. You get people where they come out of a relationship and they're rightfully really upset. You get people who come out of relationships and they're like, this is really good. It wasn't working for me. And so it's the same event, but people are framing it in a different way. And I'm not saying either one's right or wrong, but it certainly, tells you a bit about the person or about what it meant for them. And so narrative therapy is about the meaning that people attribute to different events in their life and how that shapes their personality over time. Really cool idea that came out of that hopefully you're going to like it in terms of your, as a one to add to the writing toolbox. There was a narrative psychologist called Alfred Adler. And he had this idea. The first idea was that people are really informed by their early family life, especially in the number of siblings and how they relate to their siblings.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's probably a bit of a no-brainer now in psychology. The other idea he had, though, he called it a fictional final goal. And he believed that one of the strongest motivating forces in life for someone is that we all have this fictional final goal that we're aspiring to. And so it's fictional because it's not necessarily grounded in reality. It's not like, I want to have eaten every type of cereal by the time, I reach the last stages of old age or something like that.
Right.
It's not, you may be like that's an interesting goal, but you may be shooting too low if that's, your only goal. But for most people, it's probably something undefined, like I want to be rich or happy, or I want to be something that I wasn't when I was young, and so now I want to, achieve that, or I want to be something where the media tells me this is important, so it must be, having diamonds or whatever.
And so it's usually not a very clearly defined thing. It's just a sort of vague image of what they want to end up as.
Yeah, and so Alfred Adler thought that the content of this fictional final goal and the degree to which it's realistic and achievable was a big predictor of, I suppose, healthy coping throughout life, and just, being able to manage your life in a way that helps you avoid avoid can be a bad thing, but a way that you're just able to manage distressing circumstances. I guess resilience would be a good word to use for that.
Yeah, okay. Right, so your resilience in these these events that happen to you, like a breakup, can, I guess your final goal, what was it called? Your final
fictional final goal.
Fictional final goal could alter the way that you deal with something like a breakup now.
Yeah. So what are you shooting for? If you're shooting for happiness, that's a very nebulous concept. If you've got maybe a more concrete idea of what happiness means to you, is it having like a family? Is it living in a certain area? Is it having a degree of financial security? All of that sort of thing. Once it's becoming more concrete, and more achievable, that's usually a predictor of better coping throughout life and healthier ways of framing things. But just that idea that as characters, we as people have these fictional final goals, we may not be completely conscious of them, we may not define them in, concrete terms. But we've got these things that are kind of pulling us towards them. We don't really know, like, in terms of scientific evidence, whether that's right or wrong. My feeling is that there's probably plenty of other things that progress people throughout life or that motivate them. But I think there's something to it. And I think when you're thinking of someone as a character, you always have to think, well, what's motivating, what happens? The thing I always think about when I see, like, a movie with a tremendous conflict or the type of pathos that, we see in written stories is what happens to the characters next.
Yeah. It's almost like it's like a bit of gravity far off in the distance that, as events change you got to kind of recenter yourself to get back towards this goal but it has this kind of pull to it because like you say, like it's your final goal. So everything you do kind of has some vague little movement in that direction. So is it that the person who has a more realistic and clearly defined final goal copes better? Is that
it kind of falls in with the Jungian and Freudian stuff in it. It's not an easy concept to conduct research on, but generally that's what they find in terms of measures. So in psychology, when we say, I guess, measures of mental health, we normally mean things like the intensity or the frequency of experiences involving things like depression, anxiety, negative emotional experiences. So I don't want to portray those as things people shouldn't be feeling because, to be honest, if, depression, anxiety, I'll use sadness rather than depression because it has less of that sort of, severe connotation. But negative emotions are really important in life. They're important for telling you when to get out of situations that aren't good for you. They're important for motivating you into the future. They're important for a whole bunch of reasons. But normally, people who have had really severe, intense clinical mental health experiences, normally they have these final goals that aren't as well realised.
Okay. Yeah. Wow.
So in terms of definition, and so I shouldn't, maybe realised isn't the best term because it probably doesn't matter if you ever achieve these things. It's a motivating force of character.
Well, I'm going to add that to my character profile sheet. I've got a sheet that I fill out when I create a new character. It has everything from shoe size to eye color and who's their mortal enemy. And
that's
I'll
really
add
cool.
what is their fictional final goal. Yeah, and how realistic is it?
Excellent. Yeah, well, hopefully that helps you, get into that mindset of, well, what are they thinking? What are they striving for? What are they striving for beneath what they're striving for on the surface?
Yeah. I'm just trying to think, when we first talked about doing this interview, you had some ideas about what we could talk about, and it was more about structuring writing. And you said one thing about knowing the rules so you can break them.
Yeah.
What did you mean by that? Where did you want to go with that when you mentioned that as a subject?
Oh, well, I just think, so one of the things, so I've mentioned scientific writing is very stilted, it's very cold, it's not about using emotive language, it's not about saying, this study found a fascinating finding that this could happen and using florid prose.
Yeah.
It's about basically, here's what we did, here's what we found. And there is an element of creativity in that around that you've got an introduction and a discussion where you are free to take it in a direction to an extent. It has to speak to what you've done and what you've found, but you are free. That's where you do your thinking and you kind of set things up for the reader and they're able to say, oh yeah, looking at the data, I see why you have drawn this conclusion. That said though, it's very rigid, and one of the things that I think actually breeds creativity sometimes is having constraints and then forcing yourself to be creative within them. So it can help give something just enough structure that it is working well.
Yeah.
As an example, you mentioned at the start of this radio interview or podcast, you were talking about my Year 12 English writing.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I remembered that was being passed around in Year 12, our mutual friend Joel was a fan and started circulating it around everyone, was I wrote some coursework where we did like an essay, but you got to practice one first. But they took the practice one as your mark if it was better than the proper one. And I did one where I was fortunate enough to do really well on the practice one, and basically I didn't need to sit the full essay if I didn't want to.
Right.
And so what I did is I challenged myself to write it purely in alliteration. So basically every time a letter was used, there had to be like three words beginning with that letter in a row kind of thing. And so I just did that because it's like, oh, well, I've got, what is it, an hour and a half to mess about kind of thing.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And so that sort of process, it doesn't always give you gold, but I think there's a lot to be said in the, you've got to learn the rules before you can break them. So you need to know how to structure a paragraph, how to structure a sentence before you start messing it to convey something about a character or to convey something like, I was reading a book the other day where one of the characters is very, I guess, chaotic. It's actually like kind of a demon thing. It's a chaotic organism. And so because of that, the writing, when it's from its perspective, is really, it's out of sync. It's not using conventional grammar, it's blending words together, it's stream of consciousness type stuff.
Yeah.
But you've got to know how to write stuff in a kind of stilted, appropriate finishing school grammar before you can start breaking the rules. If you want to be taken seriously, and it gives you a sense of, well, if all of your writing's breaking the rules, suddenly it's not special anymore. You need the tone to have the bits where the reader's catching their breath before you do start taking them in a different direction.
Yeah. I heard this study once, I've got no idea if it's a real thing that happened, but it was something like they got a bunch of kids and put them in a field and they tended to stick somewhat together. They didn't explore. But if they put that same bunch of kids in sort of like a paddock with a fence, they'd explore all around it. So it's like the safety of having known boundaries gives them the courage to sort of explore. In some weird way, that's a good example of that. Like, I do this program called Sticky Note Stories, and the idea is you get 6 post-it notes to tell the best story that you can. And you can do anything. You can draw, you can write, you can make a comic, you can just write really small. But it's enough of a constraint that people take that challenge, and then suddenly there's no writer's block. It's like, okay, what am I going to do with these 6 post-it notes? It's an interesting little thing, isn't it?
Yeah. There's a I'm gonna get the name wrong because my French isn't that good, but it's called like Uberpo or something like that. It's like a French word that's actually merging like 3
Sounds
French
like
words.
German.
So I'm not just wrecking French pronunciation. I'm wrecking like.
We don't have any French.
A merged word of French pronunciation, but I came across this I was reading a book on history of comics internationally. So the art form of making comics. And the French have this literary movement where it literally just started as a club of respected authors in, I think it was like early 1900s France. And they were basically like, let's set a challenge and we have to use that to sort of meet the challenge, but so it's constraining their writing. But they found it was breeding a huge amount of creativity, and so this ended up being applied in other areas. I think there might be a musical variant and like a film variant, but I came into this idea from the comic variant and was like, wow. So things like having to have your page, you can't mess with frames. It just has to be like 6 squares or something like that. Or you have to have a character transitioning between every square, or it has to read both forwards and backwards. So just things like that.
That's a rule of that French, what was it called, Uber thing?
Uberpo is let's just call it that.
Uberpo. It has to read backwards and forwards.
I was just, some of those were just coming off the top of my head, but I'm fairly sure that was one that had been done.
Yeah, right.
So that they would just throw these things out as almost a really kind of writing community, grassroots exercise, and people just would get into it.
Yeah, that's really cool. It's like the haiku. People love it because it's got a set of rules, and you can be creative within the set of rules. Yeah. And if you break them, it's like, get out of here with that.
One that just sprang to mind when you said haiku, there's a set of Japanese films. One's called 2LDK. The other one is called Origami. How these films originated, you can pick them up on eBay. They normally actually come together. How they originated is the directors bet each other that they couldn't make a decent film with only 2 main characters. So it's a full-length 2-hour cinematic release movie.
Yeah.
But it can only have two main characters talking. And so there are some like background actors, I think. So Origami, I know, has like 5 actors in it all up and a few other lines of dialogue. But for the most part, they're just 2 characters, 1 setting. And the bet was you can't make a decent film with this. And
Wow.
they're interesting films. It's really cool.
Yeah. I was just thinking about that movie Phone Booth. Remember that?
Oh, yeah, Colin Farrell, right?
It's like,
yeah.
I don't know. I feel like that came from a bet. Like, I bet you can't make a film that's completely set in a phone booth.
Yeah.
Challenge accepted.
There was one that came out. Oh, I can't remember what it's called, but one came out this year where the whole film is a gunfight in a warehouse. I don't know if that...
Okay.
It's by, I think he's an Irish director, but yeah, essentially, it was, let's make an entire film, but it's set during the gunfight pretty much.
That's cool.
And so, yeah, by setting yourselves little rules like that, even if it's just something you're doing yourself mentally and it's the beginning of an idea, maybe you end up breaking the rule, but it can be a real starting point for creativity. It really is that breakout effect, like you said.
Yeah, I give all the kids that do Launchpad, I give them a theme, and the idea is to give them the vaguest theme possible. Because if it's too specific, that has the kind of opposite effect where... like, for example, one school was having their 150th year anniversary, so they were making a book to celebrate that. So we did the theme 150 years. That book has something like 90 stories in it, and they're all about time travel. So it's like a little bit too specific. But I give them the theme a journey or a quest. And that's it. And
that's cool.
Yeah, and that's enough. It's vague. They can pretty much write any story and they can fit it into that theme. But it just breaks through that initial writer's block of what am I going to write about. You say, oh, why don't you write about a journey or a quest? And they go, oh, yeah, okay, well, they could go on a quest about, and then off they go. Yeah. But, yeah, no, if you give them complete freedom, you're not going to get anything out of them. Yeah.
Yeah.
Too daunting.
And I think it is important that editorial process, so one of the things in scientific writing is it is kind of just like, you have that thing in kung fu movies of the master trying to teach the apprentice and you mess up doing your stance and they hit you with the bamboo sword or whatever. I mean, modern university it's come a ways from that, but it is that process of you're working with someone who is massively more experienced than you and they want to train you to be an excellent scientific writer and you need to listen to them and, when they say something's not good enough, you have to respect them as kind of you don't have to call them master like in the kung fu movies, but you're working with someone with like 30, 40 years more experience. You should listen to their advice. And so one of the things I got from my supervisor was just this attention to, if you do something, you do it well. And if something seems like it's good enough, you go back through it and you make sure it's good enough,
Yeah, right.
You make sure every word is doing what it should be doing. In scientific writing, that's kind of boring because it's normally just about making it more concise. In literary writing, though, you want to go back through and make sure things like, well, I put this word there. Is it creating the emotion I want to convey? Or is this leading into what I want here? Or does this character need to exist?
Yeah. I think all the great writers throughout the ages would say they do a similar process where it's, every word's there for a reason and every word's been carefully considered and selected and rearranged and there's no I guess you've got those writers who do the stream of consciousness thing when you're Jack Kerouac, but no, I think that's pretty good advice for anyone writing in any field. Yeah.
We talked about conditioning before, and that actually got me thinking in terms of setting up expectations, because that's what conditioning is. You're basically pairing something with another thing. So when you apply it to like animal training, it's like if you pee on the bed, then, I don't know, you get yelled at by your owner or something like that.
All right.
And so... with conditioning, one of the things it is basically about is just setting up expectations. So, for example, if a rat presses a red button and it gets food, 3 times in a row, well, it's going to think that it's going to get food the 4th time kind of thing.
Right.
But one of the strongest things you can do to, really make an impactful story is actually set up an expectation and then shatter it.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the ways you actually see a lot of really good authors and artists using conditioning in that way.
Okay.
And then that gives them, then when they spin things on its head, it's like, whoa.
Did not see that coming. Yeah, and that's that's the basis of a joke, isn't it? You set up an expectation and then you break it. Yeah, that's in all comedy, that's what they do. So.
Yeah, exactly. And you were talking about you use archetypes in terms of your writing. And so something you see a lot of authors doing is, you have those archetypes, but there's a fine line between an archetype and a stereotype, because these are ideas that have been conveyed through so much, human media.
Yeah.
And so one of the things authors do, of course, is you put your own spin on it and you take it in a different direction. Maybe the hero actually has a deep-seated insecurity that, the archetype doesn't have, but you're rounding the characters, and so in a way that is challenging these expectations that have been set up, not by you necessarily, but just by life and the history of literary work.
One way I'm trying to sort of, as you're saying that, I'm thinking I'm trying to do that with the book I'm writing now, I think, because something I've been thinking about a lot is the way that people contradict themselves, and especially they'll say a thing, what their value is or what they believe, but then they don't kind of act it out in the world.
Yeah.
And and when everyone tries to make their characters complex and and not too sort of 2D, two-dimensional, but I'm really trying to get to the next level of that, where the character defies themselves. So it's like almost like that duality characteristic, but even further than that, like people have whole multiplicities of personalities in them, and they don't always sort of act like themselves, I suppose.
Yeah, there's a great theory you should read up on, and anyone listening who's a writer will get a lot out of this. It's called cognitive dissonance theory.
Mm-hmm.
And so cognitive dissonance is basically a kind of psych jargon for the tension you feel when you're doing something that doesn't line up with maybe some other attitude or some value that you hold. And so
it's a way your brain dismisses the kind of... You're doing something, your brain sort of... You have this challenging thought, like you probably shouldn't be doing that, and then the dissonance is you kind of dismiss it. Is that right? It's
not necessarily. So it's normally... Well, it gives you an incentive to dismiss it because it's not pleasant. It's like just trying to think, let's say you give to charity, but you also steal buskers' hats full of money when you're walking down the street. Those two things are difficult to reconcile.
Right.
And so the cognitive dissonance is basically often when your behavior isn't matching an attitude. But a way to add some complexity is when you get into these cognitive dissonance triangles. Using, I guess, friendships is a really good one to think about it. So the example we normally trot out for sort of starting to think about this stuff is, let's say you're really into what's a topical issue? Let's use refugee rights.
Okay.
Big thing in Australia. Let's say you're really passionate about advocating for refugee rights, but you've got a friend who hates refugees. He trots out things about they're bad or they shouldn't be in the community or whatever.
So you block them on Facebook.
well then but you're friends with them as well, so they've obviously got, maybe there's a third thing, like you both enjoy, you're on the same footy team or something like that, or you're in the same writers club. And so that sets up a tension. So it's like, well, this person, there's a lot of things that are not dissonant with me, but then there's one thing that is. And so, there have been studies looking at the kind of path of least resistance there, where is it, how strongly do you hold these different attitudes that they're all in the one person, but you can certainly have attitudes that are in conflict with one another.
Yeah.
And also, what's the easiest behavior or easiest thing to change? So, for example, if you've got someone in your life who you don't see very much, and they hold opinions or principles or values that you don't agree with, that probably doesn't affect the relationship a huge amount. Because, if you rarely see them, it's probably not going to rock the boat too much.
Yeah.
If it's someone that you see, like every day or whatever, then that's going to be like, it'll keep coming up. It's going to be a larger issue, and it will probably cause more dissonance. And so, cognitive dissonance, it's been looked at in a whole bunch of different ways, whether it's those kind of attitude, behavior, person triangles, or I guess on the, overall, though, it's about just the tension we feel when some value we hold isn't lining up with another value we hold or what we're actually doing.
So that's the triangle element of it. You've got the two people, the two different...
Well, that was a bit of a more complex way of thinking about it.
I'm trying to draw the triangle shape with that example.
Sorry, we should have got the whiteboard over. But no, just one way of thinking of it on an individual level is when we're coming up for New Year's, when people make that New Year's resolution, I'm going to go to the gym, and then they don't go to the gym. That feeling of, it's you could describe it as guilt or whatever, but that's cognitive dissonance, that emotional tension of I should be doing this, and my values are that I should be doing this, but I'm not doing this.
Becoming an adult, becoming a full grown up, as you turned 30-ish, you become more and more aware of the fact that like your actions are what define you and not what you say you believe or not what you sort of say are your values, but it's like you got to act them out, otherwise it's all for nothing. That's
something that's actually very inspirational about you. I would imagine that there are many people in the world, I mean, I'm guilty of this myself, who are like, I'd really like to write a book, or I'd really like to have a creative work that, this is me, and I've put that out there into the public consciousness. And you went and did it, and that is fantastic. If people that come to your writers group learn anything from you, just that role modeling of you were that guy, you are that guy, that is fantastic.
Thanks very much.
Priceless, mate.
Well, I'm glad that someone who went through 14 years of uni and has a real actual, what's it called, a title in front of their name, doctor, can say that they're inspired by what I've done, because that's very validating. Hey, and if you make that book ever, we've got our Tuesday night writers group. Come and use our whiteboard with us.
That sounds like a plan, actually.
Now, I've got to ask you another question before we finish. Actually, I want to ask you two. I was interested to learn that you read fiction, because I just thought you're a science guy. I didn't know how much of a part of your life that would be, but you very kindly gave me this book that Dimmicks accidentally sent you.
That's right.
So when you gave me that, I'm like, James reads fiction. That's cool. What do you read? In fiction?
That's a really good question, because students that I teach always assume, because I've done all this study, that in my spare time I read psychology books, and that's not the case. Psychology, I mean, it's meaningful as my profession, but I don't want to do it it's my job. I don't want to read about that stuff in my spare time necessarily. I have other passions and interests in life. The thing that got me interested in reading when I was a kid, and I really owe this a lot because I couldn't have my career now without it, was mythology. I loved mythology, and because, it went from looking at a picture of Medusa in like a picture book to suddenly realizing, I have to learn to read to know more about things. And I was like in prep, I'm the only kid that wasn't, how they have the picture book section in the primary school library. Yeah. I was the only, one that was kind of out of that section looking at books that are on the thing with spines out and, and you have to look at titles and stuff.
Wow.
And so, mythology was what got me into reading and writing in the first place. From that, though, what I read nowadays in my recreational time is fantasy novels. So I love fantasy novels. And I also history books as well. So fantasy novels and history. So history, I just think it's really important to know, what's happened. And it also tells, history is psychology. So it's the psychology of time in a way. Whereas fantasy novels, I think it's when I moved out of home for the first time, on my wall, the first kind of picture I put up was a map of a place that doesn't exist. It's called Athos. It's a desert world from a series of fantasy novels called Dark Sun. Why I put that up is I've got this theory that the greatest human endeavor is being able to generate a world from nothing. And one of the ways we sum up worlds is, of course, drawing maps. Yeah. So you see a map for a book, you open a fantasy novel and you see that map on the front page, whether it's Tolkien's Middle-earth or, the Dark Sun's Athos. And you're just like, wow, he's just a landscape. But here are some labels and some places, and it just opens your mind. Yeah. And I just love that. And so that's why I used to have this poster on my wall. It's been circulated out at the moment, but it will make a comeback. And so,
have you ever dabbled in the world building community as a discipline?
No, I wasn't aware it existed.
Something called world building, and obviously writers get into it, especially fantasy and science fiction writers who are building worlds, and also people like video game developers who are creating worlds and
yeah.
Dungeons and Dragons type people.
Yep.
And it's exactly that when you're building a world, and it's a kind of a discipline. And how do you start? Where do you start? Where do you finish? Where do you draw the line? Because you define a place, but then do you define the whole history of that place? Do you define the future of that place? Is there an atlas? Is there a encyclopedia? Are there Bibles? And really commonly, you know where they start is with tectonic plates.
Really?
They start with tectonic plates.
That's fascinating.
And then they go from there because the tectonic plates defines the landscape, the shape of the world, and where the oceans are and where the land is, and then that dictates where the weather patterns are, where the water sources are, that kind of thing.
Wow.
So if you're going to have a river, a river is obviously pretty central to civilizations cropping up here and there.
Yeah.
That needs to, you can't just put a river there, because someone who knows about geology might say, well, you wouldn't get a river running down there because there's a hill over there, and they'll pick it apart. So they start with the tectonic plates and build up to the religion of the place, and further than that.
Wow.
Yeah. What did they trade? When they had that war, what was it over? What was their resource? What was their resource? Yeah. And the trap is that there's people that world build for 20, 30 years, because they want to know everything about their setting, but they never write the story that's based in it, or they never make the game, or they never actually make use of it. So it's one of those things. It's like it's a rabbit hole. It's a trap. Dabble in it, but know when to stop.
It's great that the internet now and that communication between people. I mean, I didn't even know a world building community existed, but at least now if this stuff is out there and it's recorded, that's really cool. You don't because it's sad to think of these lost worlds where someone has generated them, whether it's starting from a childhood idea or whether it's a focused writing exercise, and then they're just lost.
Yeah, I think the kind of the way that it works now is it's a map, and it's kind of like you can get like a wiki, like a blank wiki, and make your own sort of almost like a Wikipedia of your world. So you can talk about the places, you can talk about the people and the religions, and just make a Wikipedia thing about your world and how it relates to this map. And that's kind of how it's done these days.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
One thing, I want to do this one day, but I will happily, make this tip kind of publicly available knowledge. And this is really gross, so please don't judge me. If you want to know like a pattern of continents or whatever, I've always wanted to, once again, kind of gross, get a handkerchief when you've got like hay fever or a cold, blow your nose, the pattern of like mucusy goo, make that the continents.
That's the
I've always wanted to do that. Yeah, just be like, honk, that's the world.
Just so that 20 years down the line, when you're talking about your version of Game of Thrones, and they say, so where did you start with? And you say, well, I blew my nose one day, and I held it up, and it kind of looked like a continent, and there we go. And the rest is history.
That's the constraint I want to work with.
Yeah, and that's why Frodo is now throwing the ring into Mordor. Because I blew my nose once. Well, there you go. Favorite author? Fiction author?
Oh, that's a really tough one. So for fiction, probably in the book I gifted you for your library, it probably is Paul S. Kemp.
Yeah.
I find him, he's just a fantastic author. He comes from a professional background like myself, so he trained as a lawyer and was a lawyer for years and then started writing. And I would imagine being, in the legal profession, they have... It's that kind of catch-22 that scientific writing has, where writing is very central, it's very important, you receive a lot of training in it, but it's also very stilted and something you take a great pleasure in breaking out of that formula when you get the chance as well.
Yeah.
But I just find him really imaginative, realistic characters. There's often an edge to them and a darkness that I think brings some realism. But yeah, Paul S. Kemp, fantastic author. He also often works in shared universe settings, so he's done some Forgotten Realms stuff, some Star Wars stuff as well. And there's one of the things about shared universes is they're a constraint as well. I mean, they're fantasy or sci-fi writing by committee, often by corporation. These are like the Marvel universe.
They're the fans too.
Oh yeah,
put a huge constraint on it. Yeah,
you
can't just say, "Oh, Batman's not an orphan anymore."
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they're gonna let you have it.
R.A. Salvatore, I think, he's infamous as the guy that poisoned Chewbacca or something. And yeah, if you look it up on the internet, and it's like people did not like it, and so yeah, you kind of the middle management of writing. You've got
There's a big outcry because Batman killed a bunch of people in one of the most recent ones, Batman versus Superman, which he doesn't do. He never kills, you know. He never uses a gun, and he always sort of, you know, is humane about it, I suppose. Yeah.
So it breeds constraints because you're like, well, I've got to keep, you know, the owners of the intellectual property happy. I've got to, you know, if I just do something radically different, then that might be good in and of itself. But for the fans, that's not meshing with the whole universe thing. And so it's like, I think sometimes that can actually really breed some creativity where it's like, well, how do I take this character, make things a bit more different, a bit more interesting? If you like that, my favorite, I don't know if you'd call it a book. It was like 3 comic series: Earth X, Universe X, Paradise X, a Marvel comic series by a guy named Jim Kruger, and he basically took the Marvel universe this was in early 2000, and just made basically his version of its future and reinterpreted its past. But it's all grounded in what's actually in the comics. And, you know, you could write a reference list for it. And it is... I can't give away anything about it, but if you like comic characters, superheroes, and you like really tripped out writing, it's excellent. It is well worth hunting down a copy of the collected editions.
Dark? It sounds like it's pretty dark.
Yeah. It's I literally can't give anything away, but it's just so freaking thoughtful. It is. Yeah. It's got high points. It's got low points. In the end, it's an optimistic story. But
I love a good comic or a good graphic novel. The problem with that is there's so many bad ones that you need a good recommendation. Like Watchmen was one of the best things I've ever read.
Oh, Watchmen's excellent.
Yeah, but then, you know, you think, okay, maybe I like graphic novels, and you get another one and you're like, no, I don't like graphic novels.
That's a good thing to always never judge something by its media, always judge the individual story.
I just learned recently, only a few days ago, that Alan Moore, the guy that wrote Watchmen, wrote a novel, and it only came out last year, and I'm thinking, great, I'm going to read that. Because, you know, Watchmen was so great. Did you know Watchmen was in Time magazine's best 100 novels of the 20th century?
I had read that because I was like, cool.
Number 17 on the list. So this graphic novel about superheroes is up there with, you know, The Catcher in the Rye and, you know, all these great works of literature. So I'm like, okay, he's written a book. I'm gonna get it. It's 1,600 pages. It's one of the top 10 longest books ever written. Yeah. So I read Stephen King's It, which was an epic in itself, and that's like 2/3 of what this book is or something.
Wow.
So I don't know if I can... I really want to read it, but it's like, that's a big commitment.
Well, that's another writing thing you've always got to think about. It's not just about, is it a good book, but does it bring readers in? And so I'm sure there are plenty of good books out there where the first chapter just isn't good enough at engaging people, or the first, you know, the first few chapters, the readers drop off, you know, it sits on the library pile and goes back, or they just don't pursue it, and they may be missing out on something really cool. Just while you were talking, another book popped into my head, and this one is actually, so Paul S. Kemp, he writes, I mean, you know, like often it's in a trilogy, so I like Paul S. Kemp's writing, but no one book is the best to me, you know, I like his writing generally. Earth X, it isn't an individual work, you know, it was about, I think 54 comics and then collected in some trade paperbacks. The best individual book, my absolute favourite, The Lions of Al Rassan by Guy Gavriel Kay.
Okay.
Guy Gavriel Kay has earned his chops in writing because he worked with Tolkien's son in fleshing out some of the other Middle-earth stuff that came after Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
So that's, to my mind, as big as you can get in fantasy.
Yeah.
Guy Gavriel Kay, I haven't read that much of his stuff, which is something I really want to address. Lions of Al Rassan, I was interested in Arabic history, and it kind of, at the time, it jumped out of me because I was reading about Spain and Arabic history, and I picked this book up in an op shop, and it is an absolute tour de force. Cannot recommend highly enough.
All right.
Everyone in the world should read this book.
All right. Well, I'll look for it in the op shop, which is is where I do my book buying.
Just beautifully written.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is great.
Wow. I'm going to add that to the list for sure because, I don't know, I feel like we've had similar tastes. We're both fantasy guys and you're very highly endorsing this book right now.
Yeah, I basically force it. I think I've bought like 4 copies of it so far now because I buy it and give it to people and I'm like, read it.
Do you ever read any Terry Pratchett? I feel like you'd like
no,
that.
I haven't. I would like to though.
Yeah.
It's just something I've never got around to getting into.
Yeah.
I've seen some of the television adaptations, but I had a friend who was very into it, and yeah, he's talked it up.
It's great because it's good fantasy, but it's funny. And when I only read my first Terry Pratchett maybe last year, and it was kind of like, why have I never tried to be funny in my writing? Like, it's just like, no, writing's a serious thing. This is serious stuff. And it's no humor in my first 2 books. I mean, there's lightheartedness and there is kind of little bits of humor, but there's no straight up like jokes. And then you read his and it's actually really good fantasy, but it's funny and every page is funny. And you're like, why? I mean, I feel like I can be funny time to time. Why didn't I put that as one of my strengths into my writing? So that was a bit of a mind trip.
Yeah, and so
me.
that's unlocked a new sort of writing style for you. Are you going to try this out?
Well, definitely. Yeah, I already have with some short stories. I write a lot of short stories, and with doing Launchpad, and sometimes I'll sneak a short story in there for the kids.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, so I've just made them a little bit funny and tried to put some humor into them, which has been really fun.
Yeah, and different levels, I guess, because you've got your own humor, but by writing a character, you also have to generate their style of humor, or if they have one.
Yeah. For me, it's almost entirely kind of what you call British humor, which I think is probably my preferred. Like, I love those British humor type shows, you know.
The element of dryness and understatement and absurdity.
Very well said, yeah. Last question for you. I ask this to everyone if I don't forget, which I usually do forget. What's your favourite word in the English language? Obscure, interesting word.
Oh, favourite word. That is a tough one.
I probably should have told you I was going to ask this earlier because it's to put you on the spot.
There are a lot of words out there.
Yeah.
Well, sesquipedalian's always a good one. It means given to using long words. So there's a degree of irony there.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've really this is a research project for me. I need to go and think of this.
So one of the mainstays on this YouTube channel. So this is going to go on the Launchpad Writers Club YouTube channel, and I'm like, okay, I'm aware I can't get someone to interview every week, but I want to put content out fairly regularly. So what's a show I can do by myself? And I came up with a show called Define, where I literally just look up words. I sit there and I have a list of words, interesting, kind of obscure or intriguing words, and I look up the definitions and the etymology of them and find out the interesting kind of nuances. So that's why I throw this question at people, and then I'll chuck this in the next episode of Define.
Oh, okay. That's really putting me on the spot. Just as an aside, while I think, I actually do that myself when I read a novel, whether it's Paul S. Kemp or a history book. I keep I normally read in bed before I'm going to sleep, and so I'll keep I always have a notebook and a pen, and I just have lists of words, and I haven't got around to looking them up, but I will just write down. Sometimes it's a word I don't know, sometimes it's a word I think I know, but I've never checked the connotation.
Exactly what I do, yeah. Or it might be a word where it's like you're really familiar with it, but you're also like, I don't think I've ever used that word. And if it's one of those words, I've never written it, I've never said it, I know it, I've heard it a million times, then I'll put it down and I'll define it. And yeah, it's intriguing words, or words you just want to know more about.
Well, a word
I do exactly that, yeah.
A word I think about that I think, A, it's a cool word, B, it can probably be used for describing things in a weird way in different settings. It's boustrophodon. And so boustrophodon means as the ox plows. And basically it means, so to put it, use a reading example, if you read from left to right and then the next one from right to left, you would be moving in a boustrophodon pattern in your with your eyes. And where I came across that word was, so I went to Turkey a few years ago, and there was a civilization in Turkey called the Hittites. And they had this script where no one could work out, like, famous linguists and scientists couldn't work out how do we translate these essentially hieroglyphics, some of them more cuneiform symbols. But, how do we translate this? And one of the things that was stumping people was one guy was like, hang on, if I use this system I've developed, I get every second line, I get every first line. What's going on with every second line though? And then he finally realized, if you read it backwards. And so they actually did their writing like that.
Boustrophodon.
Yeah.
Is that the word?
Yeah, Boustrophodon. Boustrophodon.
Wow. All right.
So
Great
there
word.
is a word to
never
gift to
heard
the
that.
community.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you very much. Well, James, Dr. Collett, thank you so much for joining us here.
Oh, thanks, mate. It's been a pleasure.
All right. That's how it's done.
Wow.
What do you think of that?
Oh, that was awesome. That was really exciting. I hope it gives people things to think about.